Yeah, yo, is it that wrong? I'm making a song, I'm taking it back for the platform that I formed. Music helping me transform. I run the reservoir, the predator.
Hello, my name is Francisco Escobar and welcome to Conversamos. Today we're going to speak about the current census and the hashtag IDNative 2020 movement. But before we begin, I'd like to introduce our panel. Ricky Cardona, Leslie Tapia,
Ricardo Sarmiento, Inca Rich from Indigenous 1492,
Valentin Ortiz, Perla Alvarez, Petrona Dominguez, Alex Kiawi from Brown Continent, and Citali from Mexican Excellence. Thank you all for coming. With the census out for completion, it is very important that we all fill it out as it will put money into our communities. As we are going to dive in deeper with the understanding of the census, first, my question to you all is, how has your journey with identity influenced you in understanding and completing the census?
So right when I saw, do you identify as Mexican, Mexican American, or Chicano, I clicked yes. Then I went to the race question, and again, I didn't think I was gonna struggle filling that section out, but I did. I read the categories, same categories as 2010. And then in the other box, I found myself struggling, and I'm like, what do I put in the other box? So what I did is I filled it out again, and I put Chicano or Chicana.
But here for me, on my own journey, I never really identified as white. I didn't identify as Native because I didn't really have any immediate connection to a Native tribe, as some friends in my school in Mexico did. And so for me, it was always like, well, what I know from history, growing up in Mexico and in the US, that's a little different unless you seek it out yourself, is that we are a mix of people, or at least that's how I see myself. And I was like, well, I identify more as a mestizo. I'm not Native, I'm not white, I'm not black, but mestizo to me feels comfortable. And whenever I fill out the census, and my sister will ask me, she's like, what did you put in for the race thing? And I'm like, well, I put other because there wasn't a section for me. And yeah, you put your origin and you put Latino, Hispanic, and then I put Mexican descent and mestizo. And so for me, when people really want to get into that conversation and they ask me, that's what I say. I'm like, I'm mestizo. I'm not white. And I grew up in Kansas, so I know what quote unquote whiteness and white folks are. And I was like, I'm not that. And so when it came to the census, I just felt like I had to specify. And I think that lends itself to how hard it is to think about your identity when you're not even a line item on a census, and you kind of really have to do more work to figure it out for yourself.
And in the census this year, one of the main things I noticed was the boxes. It tells you who you are, Hispanic, Spanish, Latino, or if you're like Dominican and other. But one of the main things that they left out was the identity for those who don't recognize themselves with any of those boxes. I put other because I recognize myself as Afro-Taino, and I don't feel comfortable recognizing myself with Latino or Hispanic or Spanish. Not Native American because I'm not from America originally.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I know that the Census Bureau a couple years ago, they were talking about restructuring that question to make it easier to identify, so that way you don't have to pick like Hispanic, Latino, and then struggle to pick your race out. But as we know, this administration isn't exactly keen on all kinds of like different suggestions, and so that never really happened. I identified as Hispanic Latino first, just because I know that my mom's from Cuba and my dad's from the Dominican Republic.
Thank you, Ricky. And Alex, what do you think about this Hispanic Latino identity?
I never agreed with the term Hispanic or Latino because I didn't have any sort of internal affiliation with those terms, mostly for lack of knowledge of what they meant at that point in time. But now I do accept my ancestral identity as Native American.
Before there was any borders, before there was like such a separation in America, there was indigenous people. And in my country, it was the Tainos. And I always identify myself as Taino or African Taino, because I always recognize myself as the African ancestors and Taino ancestors, never as Hispanic or Spanish. because that's just recognizing with the colonizers.
Thank you. And Leslie, how has your journey been with identity, the census, and understanding the terms Hispanic, Latino, or Latine?
This is the first time I've ever filled the census. I will be guilty as charged and say that I didn't fill out the census with my family in 2010. I didn't really see it as something important at the time. And I don't know if that was just like, my miseducation at the time, or like my miscommunication in terms of like how important it was to, try to represent your community. And for me, like in terms of my identity, like I grew up in Bolivia. Like my mother's Bolivian, my father's Ecuadorian, but my childhood was spent in Bolivia. So when I came here, it was a little bit difficult because I didn't exactly think I was Latina because I spoke Quechua at an early age. So I was like, okay, I guess I'm Spanish or Hispanic. And there's so many more terms that have been thrown. And for me, it was just either you were Latina or Hispanic, or now it's like Latinx. And now it's like, you don't want to go ahead and anglicize like the term. And I'm just like, I'm so confused. So I honestly didn't know what to go ahead and put in this year's census, because I don't want to go ahead and come from a place of disrespect. I want to be open-minded. I want to go ahead and see why is it that all these terms are thrown around and be more educated into it. So for me, for example, this year, I just put other because I know that I am Latina, but at the same time, like my grandmother, she comes from an indigenous tribe.
I always had the identity piece of like, am I white enough? Am I Mexicana enough? Because those were like the only two options that I had. And I felt very, like, I feel like I just did not belong with the people that I was interacting with. I've come to learn in terms of how, being educated more on the census and being able to now see the importance behind it. I also just chose to do other and just put from Guatemala. But I also added in another terminology that they'll probably just boot away. But I ended up putting I'm a unique human being full of different complexities in it. So aside from Guatemala, I just put that in because I've acknowledged to this point that there's a lot of social statuses that are going to try to push us into these different identities, but really I don't think we're ever going to come to an agreement of where you're from, who are you from, because there's so much still to learn from it, and we all have different complexities and different identities within us, and we're so interconnected in so many ways. And so I think just acknowledging that piece, I've just come to realize that if it comes to that point, right, and being asked, I just say that I have a lot of different bloods within me, and there's a lot of different strands, and I won't pick one or the other because at the end of the day, we're just full of different identities within us. So,
well, I was born and raised in LA, from South Central to Watts, California, Tonga territory. And growing up, the way identity was introduced to me was Los Americanos, right? So a lot of our parents, they racialized being American to being white. This is the second time I'm participating on the census. 10 years ago, I was, I'm still on this journey, and I identified as Wirarica. That's the indigenous population that I know from the part of the land that I'm from, which is Jalisco, Mexico. And now, 2020, I identified as Nahua. Nahua is a cultural landmark for people that speak Nahuatl, the indigenous language. And as a Mexicana living on Tonga territory, right, with our northern relatives, I feel that the census offers me, I'm seeking decolonization. I'm seeking to reclaim who I am. I'm seeking to fight against the way that the government homogenizes our communities. And my biggest question is always, why aren't people of color who speak English being homogenized the same way as people of color who speak Spanish, right? And I think that speaks to the power of the division among Europeans, right? The Southern and the Northern Europeans, the Eastern and Western, and we're caught in between. And so with the census, I'm very passionate about this because I think it's an opportunity for us in all of our respective nations and all of your respective complexities. It's an opportunity for us to tell the world in the census bureaucracy who we are, right? whatever that system identifies with, I identify as Indigenous, and that's something that continues. It's a journey that's not black and white, right? As we're all hearing from each other's stories, but because I choose to resist, white supremacy and the homogenizing of Indigenous communities throughout all of the so-called Americas, I'm very passionate about that. And I think it's a great opportunity for all of our peoples, regardless of our nations and states, to honor my great-grandmothers, to honor those languages that have been repressed and have been systematically, participated in the system of genocide. And so that's been my particular journey.
In 2010, I did identify as Native American, and this year, my family and I, we did the census, and we identified as Native American. Because if you're looking closely at the census form, and Citlali hit on a very interesting point. Yes, why are they attacking through silent weaponry brown people? Because if you look at the census, they immediately put Hispanic, Latino up at the very top to dissuade brown people who speak Spanish or have Hispanic names and surnames to go down to the list and check the Native American box. So it's a way of keeping us, because of the programming, or us, what we already think we know about ourselves, how we are going to identify. They put it up at the very top. And, Black people who speak English are not going to be Anglo people, Brown people who speak English, they'll be generally called Mexican American or Americanos. Southern Spanish-speaking people who are brown, they're immediately going to call them foreigners, immigrants, migrants, anything to distance them from the entire continent. When they make it up here in this, it's very tricky here in the United States. For me, it was quite a journey. And every now and then, I'll admit, you do feel that uncertainty creep in, that, no, you're probably not really completely, because the Northerners sometimes don't accept us. And also using the power of the census, showing our number. And I think if we look every 10 years, I think, Citlali, you might know that the Native American category is getting bigger and bigger every 10 years, exponentially, So I think what Citlali is doing with the hidden natives, I think is a very good idea, and also these videos that are showing the ladies in their ropa civil, and then they get into their ceremonial clothes. The face is still the same, but when we get to see the native side. So, but yes, I identify as Native American wholeheartedly, from Patagonia to Alaska.
Thank you for sharing, Alex. Now let's go with Perla, then Valentine.
Filling out the census was a journey for me as well. So 10 years ago, I did fill out the census for my family. I migrated to the United States in 2006. And so it had been like only 3 years. So I could barely understand the census 10 years ago, but I had to fill it out for my family, right? And I didn't ever really had to think about what I was, because I was in middle school, I think, or high school, right? So when I filled out the census and I came across the race category, I was so confused. I was like, I'm not white and I'm not Black, and I can't see myself represented in the race questions. And I was filling it out for my whole family. So what I did is, I remember clearly that 10 years ago, I checked every single box on the race question, because I didn't know. I honestly had no idea what to put.
Because the last time I filled out the census, I filled it out as Hispanic. I didn't know any better. But I would say in 2011, my journey started to decolonize what I thought my history was, and like reclaim my actual identity. For a long time, I always thought I was Hispanic or Spanish or American, anything but what I actually am. Coming from Dominican Republic, there's always been this type of identity crisis, because growing up there's always as, you don't want to identify as too dark. You always want to be lighter, the lighter the better. Kind of internal hate. they kind of teach you that when you're a child, just to always go for the lighter, and the lighter the better, because you don't want to identify with your neighbors who are Haitian.
Thank you, Valentine. Let's end this with Inca Rich. How has completing the census been for you?
It was difficult because I didn't know what to put, but I put from my mom's side, I put that I'm Maya Pipil, and from my dad's, I couldn't really pinpoint it, but just how like Citali said earlier that she put Nahuatl, I put Quechua for my dad's side just because I can't really pinpoint the tribe where we come from in Ecuador. So that's how I identified this year in the census. And I thought that was really important for me to do that because 10 years ago, I wasn't really like on this red road path, like trying to figure out who I was or who I am. So I don't even think I did it 10 years ago. I don't even know if my parents did it 10 years ago. But this year I felt like it was important because throughout this whole 10 years, you know, I've been looking in my ancestry, and it's cool seeing documents of like from 100 years ago. And it would be cool if 100 years from now, someone could find like, oh shit, he identified as that, you know? So.
Nice. Now I'd like to ask, how has your family and the environments you lived in and currently live in influenced your identity? And then how has engaging with family members and friends been when it comes to understanding identity?
Some of the questions I ask is like, well, where did you grow up? Or do you speak Spanish? Not that it's defining. Or, you know, what generation are you in your family? How long have you been here? I think that often informs a lot of where they find themselves. Because, you know, when you're talking about assimilation, I think that's precisely where you find them on that road. That often for me gives me a good sense of not necessarily their thinking, but maybe how they may identify or explain why they identify as American. So, my mom's from Cuscatlan, what we now call El Salvador, and my dad's from Chichansuyo, what we now call Ecuador. So like those are my roots where I come from, Ecuador, El Salvador. So like growing up, you know, all my friends were Mexican. So like people would always just, oh, the Mexicans. I would get called Mexican a lot. So like I got used, has always been weird. You know, I look Filipino. No one really knew what I was. And I didn't really know what I was because I never met other Ecuadorian kids around me, or there were Salvadorian kids, but not as much as like Mexican kids. So identity for me had always been weird. My dad, he would always go to Ecuador and bring back like decorations for the house, and everything that he brought, it always had like native people on it. So I was always like, oh, okay, that's probably the Ecuadorian culture. I would see photos of tribes from Ecuador. So I always identified as native.
Yeah, if I can just share, I'm a school office manager and I overlook registration. It's very interesting how we get families that are straight, like coming in, indigenous speaking, right, from Guatemala or regions in Mexico. And in the registration paperwork, they'll put white, you know, because on the enrollment registration, it's race. It asks you if you're Hispanic or Latino first and foremost, and then it goes into race. And I've always, you know, and it's not my job at that time, right? I'm at work and we have that conversation elsewhere. But I always, you know, understood that to mean a lot of our people, you know, we see the term American as white. And I think our people see it as status, as power. And I think the racial notions and the psychology behind how we view America or American is racialized white. And I don't know if you guys could relate, but I know my mom growing up, like I said, when she talks about los Americanos in her mind are white people. But because it's taboo to call white people, like a lot of our family members, right, they'll say, ay, el Americano, or here comes the American, or here comes the Americano. And in my mind, I see a white guy and I tell my mom, oh, you mean el güero, el gabacho? She's like, ah, sí. So I think, you know, that's been my experience where I understand the racial connotations of American.
So identity for me had always been weird. My dad, he would always go to Ecuador and bring back like decorations for the house, and everything that he brought, it always had like native people on it. So I was always like, oh, okay, that's probably the Ecuadorian culture. I would see photos of tribes from Ecuador. So I always identified as native, like
in elementary school, and we would take those tests once a year. I would never put Hispanic or Latino, even at that age. Like, I always would put whatever the native category was, Pacific Islander category. But I never knew my identity.
Similar to what Citlali was saying, in terms of like, you know, growing up and I guess labeling already how like Americans are. My mom, same thing, you know, she automatically assumed you're American, you're white. And for us, that's heck no, because the only one that ever really like, I guess was even more confused than I was actually my little sister, because in comparison to both my brother and I, she is white, like literally almost like as white as my coat. And sometimes people wouldn't think that we were siblings. So they would only have to like really look at our faces and be like, no, it's because my mom is dark, my father is white. Well, skin color, white. So for me, I feel like we live in a generation where it's very sensitive to talk about these topics. Obviously, we are very, very powerful people just talking about this topic right now. You know, just people become so sensitive that any little thing kind of bothers them when you talk about race, when you talk about your background, when you're trying to make that self-discovery for yourself. I know that for me, I'm born and raised in Queens. So for me, when I went to high school and even through like middle school, somewhat of primary school, because I was on disability, so that's why I came back here. I was predominantly Hispanic, and also like there was a couple of Black people here and there, or African Americans. And when I went to NYU, there's hardly any minorities whatsoever. So when you do start meeting other Hispanics, some of them actually come from these suburban areas, and they don't come from, you know, our kind of neighborhoods where, okay, well, I was born with speaking Spanish because my mother always told me, usted habla castellano, usted habla español aquí en la casa, pero afuera usted me puede hablar lo que usted desee. Because for her, the Spanish language itself just made you identified with your Latinidad. Like for her, if you don't speak Spanish, how could you be Hispanic? Or how could you even be from South America?
Just looking at people, you know, yes, there's a lot of similarities among brown people, but when you look into your own personal history or ask people, where do your parents come from? And where do your grandparents come from? We encourage people to investigate their family history, interview your aunts and uncles. Somebody's gonna have some sort of a history there that'll tie you to the land. The way I found out my dad's side of the family was my great-grandmother, Eduarda Gándara, was born in Coahuila. And it turns out that her madrina used to call her La Teca or Teca, porque era una india de los cerros. And I didn't know where she was from. And I asked my dad, why Teca? And he said, well, he said, porque era india, su madrina, you know, her madrina would put her down. It is una india. Teca, but where is she from? She said, Coahuila. Oh, Coahuilteca. Okay. So now you start putting little things together.
Nice, yeah. Ricky and then Leslie, would you mind sharing specifically on where and how you were growing up?
I grew up mostly in upstate New York in Walk Hill, which was an hour and a half, 2 hours from New York City, north. And there's a bunch of white people. It's a white suburb. And so, like, my mother did try to teach me Spanish, but that's just something I never picked up on because, you know, it's not like reinforced by the people around me. You know, I grew up with mostly white people. And you know, by the time I moved to Palm Beach in Florida when I was 13 and I went through high school and stuff, I, again, knew no lick of Spanish whatsoever and was sort of trying to learn it because, you know, I needed to learn a foreign language for high school, but also I wanted to kind of like communicate better with my relatives.
So for me, it wasn't just you're either white or you're Black. Like over there, you're either mulata or you are really, really Black or you are really, really white and you're from European descent. So for me, I didn't understand when I was called as a child mulata back then, that it was just so heartbreaking, for like my grandmother, because it was just like confusing the child even more. As in, okay, you're not true Black, so you're not exactly, not validated in the country, but you're not white enough to say that you are actually an important person in this country.
And I think even speaking about race, I think it's really important, because even with my mom now, I've been doing this for 23 years, and we've had these conversations, and my mom was like, damn, nunca lo había pensado así, o nunca me había expresado, nunca lo había imaginado. So for those who don't understand, she's saying like, I didn't understand. I didn't know why I was viewing them like that, right? And so I think it's interesting how it highlights the taboo culture of our people, right? Not talking about race, not talking about white people, that it's impolite, that you don't talk about white people. You could talk about every other race, but the way I grew up, it was taboo. You don't talk about that. You don't bring that up. And so, that's been my experience with American. And if people choose to call themselves American, obviously I respect, I'm not here to convince people, but I'm here as a historian, as an activist. I think there's a lot to unpack in how Americanism has been packed and has been manufactured. So I think it's about asking questions. We're gonna get these conversations. So I'm glad and grateful that you're doing this. So thank you.
No, thank you. Petrona, would you mind having the last word on this?
I know that for me, it actually was very different. I never really had that experience of trying to figure out if I was Hispanic or Latina. If anything, here where I'm at, it's a very conservative area, and it's very white centered, but there's also a lot of people from Mexico, and specifically from Michoacan, Mexico. And so my family comes from Guatemala. My whole entire family still speaks their native language, which is Canjobal. And so when I moved to the US when I was 4, that's the only language that I knew. I never really knew anything about Spanish. There was like a couple of words. And then English también, that was a whole new challenge for me.
Thank you all for sharing. Now on the topic of education, Alex, with Brown Continent, you do a lot of work helping people, myself included, navigating our Indigenous identity. Would you mind sharing more about this?
We've helped a lot of people. Like we had that, several of us commented on your inbox messages on Instagram, and our Facebook page is flooded with messages from people. And I'm sure some of you, Lali, you'll probably run into a lot of these people who will message you and, I don't know who I am. Can you tell me how to find out who I am? It's very sad. It is very, to me, it hits hard because I was there. But we actually try to provide them resources to start investigating. First, we tell them, start talking to your family members, find out where you're from, where were they settled for the longest amount of time that you can think of, and like we provide them maps. We grab stuff off the internet and links, and we help them out. I said, look, let's just and we use the white people's tools because the majority of us, that's all we know, and I've done this map exercise with a lot of elementary school children, brown children, whose parents are from the South, and I give them pictures of white people, brown people, native people, all the way from South America to Alaska, modern pictures, the way they look in regular clothes, Black people, and different kinds of different Asian people. So from their perspective, this is the world of brown children from the South who live here in the United States. All the native people, they put in Mexico. Okay, that says a lot right there. They say, like, it could be Dene, it could be Arahuaspeca, it could be Inuit from Alaska, Aymara. They put them all in Mexico. The white people, they put in the United States. All the Black people, without any question, they put in Africa. Okay, because I tell them, where do you think they are from originally? So there's no real right or wrong answer. I want to know what they think. And all the Asians, they put in China. So after going through Asia, sorting them out, we're like, they think about like, there's Mongolia, what's that? Oh, Korea, Malaysia. And then Africa, no problem. With the white people, I said, where are they from? They said, they're from here. I said, no, they're not. And I said, we're going to talk a little bit about history. Right? And I always tell them, because in their world, 500 years is going to be an eternity. So I said, not too long before you were born, they came here in boats that look like this. And I hold up pictures, and they came from a land called Europe. And I asked them, does anybody know where Europe is on the world map? And they point to it. Okay, let's move all the white people back to where they come from. And they do it. So I pull out a Western Hemisphere map. I said, now all the brown people here in Mexico, that is not a wrong answer. But, I pull out the Western Hemisphere map. Now we're going to take it further, and I pass out more brown people pictures. And, okay, now where do you think they're from? Again, the majority of them, the pictures end up in Mexico and now Texas, because they live here. And once we start going through them, sorting them out, they didn't know that there were brown people in Canada. They didn't know much about Argentina and Chile, the Mapuche, the Aymara, the Quechua, Colombia, the Quichua, Central America, the Pipil, and all the different nations in Mexico. And I remember one mother got the Canadian model, Ashley Collingbull, and she said, oh, I know where she's from. She's from the Yucatan, because that's what they look like. I said, okay. So when we fixed the pictures, I picked it up. I said, ma'am, esta foto, ella es nativa americana de Canadá. And she was like, what? There's Mexicans up there? No, they're from over there. So it's like, it's a visual, and it's very powerful. It's worked a lot.
Most definitely. And as a teacher, I'm deeply humbled to hear this activity you have. Thank you. Citali, as someone who has your own YouTube channel, Mexican Excellence, what important messages are you most adamant about sharing, and how do you bring that message to your community?
And I think it's really important for all of us to understand how capitalist systems also lend themselves to racializing people and exploiting them. And there's been research, and I welcome you guys to check out the work on my YouTube and all that. But there's been specific, entities that they spend millions of dollars coming up with these concepts to exploit our population, to exploit our demographics. A lot of entertaining companies, beer industry, novela industries talk about colorism and white supremacy and white standards. But I think it's important to understand and bring the component of capitalism and how we are being exploited without our permission. They're painting this brush of, oh, everyone's Latino, everyone drink beer, everyone, let's go to this festival. And so that's the facade that's given. And I don't think, a lot of us don't have that mindset, or to think, oh shit, like, what do I have to do with this, or why am I being grouped into this? And I think it's a very unethical way to do marketing and to exploit our community. And I think it's important. And there's, like I said, there's studies, I've done presentations, I lecture. And speaking of how do we take this onto the community, I'm really grateful that you bring that up. A lot of people, they become elitists when they talk about these topics. They only want to build among their circles, and they don't want to go into the community. I take posters that say, we're not Hispanic, we're not Latino. I go and I walk around predominantly our areas, and I have conversations with our people, because I don't believe that academia is giving me the power that I need to make the change. And so I think grassroots has a lot to do with this. I think, being out there in the streets, working with our community at all levels, and not blocking ourselves up, because I've experienced that, where a lot of people, professors, don't want to come out to the community. Elite intellectuals don't want to come out to the community. And so I think that's the challenge for our generation, is make this multifaceted. Whatever your skill is, whatever your talent is, do it. Let's go out to the community, because we cannot get lost in the elitism of struggles. But I think what we're doing now, like I said, I'm very thankful for this conversation. Not enough people are having these conversations. I talk to my family all the time about this. They filled out the census, and they're like, mija, I put Native. And, it's a beautiful thing for them to rediscover themselves and be like, they were brought up in this colorist society and this white supremacist society. But for them, even if they're 60, even if they're 70, for them to feel empowered and to reconsider all these notions and actually be proud of who they are, it's beautiful, and it's beginning to happen. And I think that's our role, is to, yes, there's a lot of negativity, but I think this is an opportunity, like I said, for us to love ourselves and for us to honor our ancestors and honor our living ancestors, our abuelitas right now, our tias that are ashamed of being brown, that are ashamed of speaking Nahuatl, that are ashamed of speaking Quechua. And I think that's what this facilitates. And a lot of people are like, oh, I don't, screw the government. I don't want to participate in that. And I'm like, you don't have to want to participate in the government, because we all have socials. They're tracking everything. It's not up to us whether we participate. It's how we're going to own up that participation and how we're going to author our own representation that I think is so empowering to me.
Touching a lot on the education piece, and I think Alex just did an amazing job, honestly, of pinpointing that and like using that piece of how crucial and important it is that we implement ethnic study courses in K through 12 settings, because como dicen, I mean, we are literally learning the education of colonizers, and that's how we are coming into conflicts later on in the days. And I think it's just harder for us to accept and acknowledge that when we're at an older age. And that's why we have a lot of identity crisis, a lot of moments in our life where we seem to not want to change our perspectives, because we have just been brainwashed and we have been colonized washed, is how I say it, through our education system. And so for me, I think it's more of like, now that we've acknowledged, right, and the fact that we are all here and we're talking about this, how do you really implement these situations and these experiences out into the real world? And how do you do this with your siblings and your parents and your loved ones, right? How do we start changing our narrative? And within each culture in Latin American countries, how do we start doing that now? Because clearly this is something that we're far from yet, because we're experiencing these things and we're still seeing how it's bad to be one specific color versus the other. And the fact that we just see color in general, right? And that's how we identify people where they're from, because that's how we have cultivated that way of oppressing folks and trying to fit us into different groups for the sole purpose of just keeping the power.
That's a very good point. Valentin?
One of the most inspiring people I've ever met is a sister from Mexico who came to America, and in the process of learning English, she kind of like lost her identity because she didn't know her indigenous language. But she found that Lehman College was teaching her indigenous language from Mexico, and she went there and she took classes, and 2 years later she's here speaking fluently, and she puts video up on Facebook and Instagram speaking her indigenous language, and it's one of the main things that have reconnect her to her identity. So I encourage everybody to go out there, learn what you can, learn about your history, learn about your ancestry.
Speaking about educating ourselves in college, Ricky and then Ramiro, would you mind sharing with us your college experience and how that helped you understand who you are and where you come from?
I think later when I started going to school at NYU, I got to explore more about the history of DR, kind of like just learning different things, because I never knew about Haiti-Dominican relations until that point, and just how much African blood there was and it still is in that country, and anti-blackness is still real. And if you get a look at me, my hair doesn't exactly look like that of a white person, so it's something that I too have struggled with. So I check both boxes off as white and black, because I feel that I'm more mixed than anything else. I can't really identify with one or the other.
And when I got to KU, I lived in Wichita, and that's where I graduated from high school. And my school, even though it was in the middle of Kansas, was 50% quote unquote Latino, Hispanic. And I was very used to speaking Spanish and seeing people that looked like me around school. Yes, in that little sliver of Kansas, that was normal. But when I went to college, only 40% of my school went to a 4-year university. I encountered a lot of the kids or young adults that lived and went to school in the suburbs of Wichita that I had never interacted with, and they were also brown. And they had a different relationship with their identity because they never really saw anybody around lunchtime speaking Spanish or being brown. They were the other. And it was easier for them to kind of just like, oh, well, I'm American, just like these kids' Italian grandparents consider themselves American. And so it was always different. It was always different. If they were of more recent immigrants, and they're like, oh yeah, I'm from Durango, I'm Mexican American, my parents don't have papers, stuff like that. It just kind of varied. And again, depending on when they find themselves in that little journey. But.
Perfect. And from that, I would like to know more about this idea of reclaiming your power, reclaiming your identity. Yes, Alex?
Since 2003, during doing some oral history interviews over in El Paso, Texas, where I was born, I interviewed this little old man who lived on the street. His family was somewhere from Durango and Chihuahua. And during the course of the interview, I remember asking him, hey, well, we have to finish up here because they're closing up the community center where they give food to the elderly there. And he said, oh, yeah, there's something I would like to say. And he said, I've traveled north, I traveled south, I've been to the East Coast and West Coast. Ha entrado a México, pero yo nací acá en el norte. He said, and he said, he spoke about how growing up north of the Rio Grande, brown people are no longer seen as their southern counterparts because of the homogenization, the assimilation. And a few key words that he said, allá en México nos hacen caras de pinacates, como si fuéramos algo aparte. He said, pero no, es que somos nativos de este continente. And upon hearing that, I remember my head shook and everything that I thought I learned at that moment emptied out. You know, everything that I thought I learned in school. It all just went flushing down a giant toilet. And I remember driving to my parents' house because I was visiting. I had already left El Paso. And looking in the mirror, and I couldn't believe that I was Native American. I said, but wait, we're the same people. We're the same. I'm the same as him. And he said, without a shadow of a doubt, I'm Native American. He had no tribal affiliation. He didn't know, but by looking at his brown face, his facial features, not all of us are that quintessential looking Native American type. He said, he is Native American, but I couldn't believe that I was. So from 2003 up to like 2008 was 5 years of, self, and then finding ceremonies and then learning to accept that as well.
Thank you, Alex. Perla?
It is still a struggle for me. I think Chicano is the term that best fits where I am right now. I am Mexican. I was born in Mexico, and that is an identity that I still carry. And sometimes I even call myself Mexicana, right? Because that way I am like including both cultures and sense of my identity in there. But I know that when I visit Mexico, I'm not Mexican enough anymore for my family, right? When I am here, I'm not necessarily like American. I'm not very Americanized, really. So Chicano is still the term that I feel the most comfortable with identifying, knowing that I am in the constant work of decolonizing my identity, and it is one of the terms used by, and reclaimed by our people.
It's always been a struggle for me, I would say up to 2013, because even after I learned my identity, it always comes with why you recognizing yourself with Taino when, most of you have been wiped out, or right? Why you recognizing yourself as African when you're not even Black? But the term Black, again, it's a word made up by the colonizers, by white people, because why identify yourself as a color, not as a person? In America, you're Black, you're not African American, and even if you're Hispanic, even if you're Latinx, you gotta recognize yourself as such. You can't even recognize yourself with your original ancestors.
The layers, there are many layers that were imposed on us. So it's a matter of how you're going to cut those layers back. You have to tell them Hispanic means you're from Spain, Hispania, España, Latin. Latin America was coined by Frenchmen in the 1830s. Ever since then, we've all been calling ourselves Latino or Latin American or Latina. And, without questioning, because we never knew better. We're born into this white reality. Think about it as the mental and the heart umbilical cord was already severed the moment we were born. without a memory. So everything we've been programmed with came via the white education system from white people. So everything we've been indoctrinated with was their version, you know. And once we all start figuring out, wait, I'm Native American then. They're like, hey, wait, well then this is my homeland. Hey, wait, I'm homeless on my homeland. What? Hey guys, we need to do something. You know, these Europeans took over now, like we're slaves. We're indoctrinated. We've been brainwashed over the centuries. We've been the subject of violence. They made us see our southern relatives look like illegal immigrants, calling them migrants repeatedly. It's branding. You know, the black people were branded with the N-word to lower their station in life. So maybe we should start saying hey, don't call me the H word, don't call me the L word. You know, I'm Native American, I'm original to the Western Hemisphere. And then you put on top of that the nationalities from the countries that the Europeans created, for the most part. You know, and we get a lot of people who say, oh, but Mexico is an indigenous name. I said, yes, but that was created by criollos. Those were the descendants of the original Spaniards who rebelled against their mom and dad, just like up north in 1776, the so-called American Revolution. Our people were used on both. Once the borders were established, we became branded with nationalities. We became branded with false ethnicity tags. And once we crossed these apartheid borders, we automatically were branded as immigrants, as trespassers, illegal aliens, foreigners, not knowing that all this time we've been on our homeland, walking around, living, breathing, eating. You know, there's many ways to tackle the whole identity thing. You know, it can be a very personal issue depending on the person. You know, sometimes we tell them, why don't you go look in the mirror? Are you black? Are you white? Are you Asian? You know, there's many ways, from mild to, you know, sometimes harsh. And sometimes the harshest work where the people who are the most offended are now working and helping with the identity movement and in brown continent. Like some of us need some sort of a shaking moment, I guess, depending on our level of indoctrination.
I'm going to zoom out a little bit, but keep it within the context of the U.S. and like the entry point is colonial North America. So when I said keep it in the context of the U.S., what does it mean? We've been built in the way that our Constitution was written, centered white folks, European settlers, because that's who had power. And that has, the legacy of that is here today. And it's precisely the reason why it's so hard to maintain your identity, because when you talk about white supremacist institutions, and I'm not talking about KKK members or skinheads, I'm talking about the tacit acknowledgement or the explicit acknowledgement that some other people are less, and white folks, the goal is to maintain power, political power in the government. And so those institutions, laws that were written that are then used to determine Supreme Court cases, and you get with funny scenarios where like, you can't really judge me because I'm supposed to be judged by my peers, but because they're not white or they're not brown. That entanglement that was created from those weird laws that were established at the very beginning, where they created the concept of whiteness and what it means to be an American. It's like we have all these institutions that have created all these gaps across a multitude of sectors, whether it's education, healthcare, transportation, public safety. Those gaps exist, and it's because unless you're black, and now we're seeing a different phenomenon with immigrants from Asia and Latin America. Well, unless if you were a European immigrant, you were expected to assimilate. And your assimilation, it's like, well, yeah, you're assimilating and you're checking the box white because that means power. You subconsciously understand that there's power in that. Well, they have the power, they run everything, they're the ones on TV, they're the ones who have to pay rent to, it must be good. So people assimilate that, but the question of what your place in America is that's not a give and take. Like, yeah, you assimilate, but you're not necessarily taking place in America, and now you are a full American.
I didn't see myself as American, even though my mom was like, you know, you're American, mija, like you're not Mexican anymore, you're American. As I've grown in my journey, and this actually started for me 23 years ago. I was in high school when I started learning and unpacking how white supremacy is used on our populations and the need to repress and belittle people of color on our continent as indigenous folks?
There's a case in Texas from the 1950s. I have to look it up. I have it saved. I think it's Chavez versus United States. There was a man who was tried for the murder of another brown man. And he felt that he was unjustly found guilty because he was not tried by a jury of his peers, which were all white people. So we're talking a brown man, Mexican or Mexican American, being tried by white people in the court system. Texas was one of the worst places to be brown or black. The case was tried, was taken all the way to the Supreme Court to overturn the verdict. So what happened in the Supreme Court, it was a unanimous decision to classify all brown people as white in order to where they couldn't argue that they weren't being judged by a jury of their peers.
This is something like that I found different was the question, where are you from, right? So like when white people ask you that question, it's weird, right? Like it's like some kind of validation, it's like a test, I guess, to see like how white are you, you know, like how American are you? That's what I always felt like. But with other people of color, like whether you're Hispanic, Latino, Black, whatever, like I never thought of it as like some kind of test. I always felt like, you know, oh, they genuinely want to know. So that's the kind of perspective that I myself have kind of used. Like I try not to ask where you're from though, because I know that's a very complicated question. So I think like if I were to approach somebody and to have this conversation, you know, I would probably go say like where did you grow up? What's your heritage? Like that kind of thing, because it's a very complicated question and it's something that's very difficult to address, and you definitely don't want to make somebody uncomfortable, but you want it to feel kind of like coming from a familiar face, you know. So I think that's just something I would use to kind of avoid that where you're from, even though like it can be controversial, you know. I try to stay as far away from that as possible.
And I feel like some people that say, not everyone, but some people that say, well, I'm an American, is that yearning to be treated equally. And maybe if I erase everything that I am and I'm just an American and I go into this myth that we're all the same or that we're all American, then maybe I'll have more power and I'll be treated more fairly. I think that's where that comes from. And now you see the impact with our country. For a long time, this country was predominantly demographically white. And it wasn't until immigration laws changed in the 20th century that you started seeing the demographic shift as birth rates in white America declined and more immigrants were coming in to keep the economy going. So I think the reason why we always talk about like, well, white people are here or there and this happened and that's why I feel excluded. It's like, yes, it's on purpose. They run shit. This is who's in charge. And I think for me politically and the way that I enter into this space and why I do what I do in terms of government is because like the way I see my role is being able to change those things. And I was fortunate enough that in my work in government, I was allowed to explore that question of racial inequity within the context of Kansas City, because all of the crime in Kansas City is wealthy. But all of the crime and all of the murder victims in this community are in the predominantly Black neighborhoods that are lower income and have less good outcomes for education or healthcare coverage. Like all of those things just compound to create these massive gap that I think speak to why we have so many differences and why they leave us all confused and why this is all entangled. At least that's the way in the framework that I use, but I know everyone comes at it from a different angle.
So I think for me, it's more of like, how do you take in this moment, right? How do you take in what we are experiencing here together collectively in terms of how we're gonna use that to educate those who have not had this experience or have had this type of space to be able to do so? Because for me, I think it's always about having the experience and also opening up the space for someone else to be able to come and engage and learn, because that's really how we're going to do change. It's not just going to come easy and go. It's really going to take, the opportunity to give that to someone else.
And on that note, that is all the time we have for today. Great job, everyone. Thank you all for coming out. And for everyone at home, make sure you like the video and subscribe to our page. In the comments section, feel free to respond. How has your journey been with understanding identity and completing the census?
And make sure you follow us on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and all our other social media outlets at Conversamos_Latinidad.
Tune in next week as we're going to have an open discussion on Afro-Latinidad in the 21st century. All here in Conversamos.
Yeah, yo, is it that wrong? I'm making a song, I'm taking it back for the platform that I formed. You should help me transform. I run the reservoir, the predator, like a hungry carnivore. When I'm breaking through these heavy doors, this is Desert Storm. A metaphor to show I'm equipped and informed. I'm striking with the mega force, I'm lukewarm. Your crew swarms with the fear my lyrics do harm. If you ain't lending a hand, I'm breaking your two arms. So listen. I'm sniffing the difference on my mission, I'm craving. I envision these premonitions like Raven, I'm gifted. I saved it, now